the tragic story behind Memories of a Murderer, the Nilsen Tapes. Netflix's true crime documentary, Memories of a Murderer, the Nilsen Tapes brings to light one of the darkest chapters in London's history, the horrifying crimes of convicted serial killer Dennis Nilsen. However, beyond the gruesome murders, the underlying tragedy is rooted in a culture of intolerance and systemic neglect. This is a story of how societal prejudice allowed Nilsen to target some of the most vulnerable individuals whose disappearances went unnoticed or ignored. The victims and the killer. Dennis Nilsen, a former police officer, preyed on young men in 1980s London. His victims were often gay men, sex workers, or homeless youths, individuals on the margins of society. Nilsen would lure these men into his home with offers of food, shelter, or companionship, only to later kill them. Over the course of 5 years, he murdered at least 12 men. But Nilsen's ability to evade capture for so long wasn't just due to his cunning or police training. It was largely because the men he targeted belonged to communities that society at the time ignored or actively discriminated against. These were people whose disappearances were not immediately noticed or addressed. A culture of intolerance in 1980s London. At the heart of this tragedy is the cultural climate of the 1980s, particularly the deep-seated prejudice against the LGBTQ+ community. During this time, many young gay men were forced to leave home due to rejection from their families. Some ran away, while others were thrown out onto the streets, becoming invisible to society. If these young men went missing, their families might not have even realized it for months, or if they did, they were often reluctant to report it. The shame associated with having a gay child meant many parents chose silence over reaching out to the authorities, fearing the stigma that would come from talking to police or being publicly outed. Institutional neglect. This culture of shame and intolerance extended beyond families into institutions like the police and the press. Homophobia was rampant, and many in law enforcement didn't prioritize missing person cases involving young gay men, sex workers, or homeless individuals. Nilsen, having worked as a police officer, likely understood this systemic neglect. He exploited it, knowing that society's prejudice would allow him to carry on with his crimes for years without raising alarm. The press, too, played a role. At the time, stories about missing gay men weren't given much coverage, and the LGBTQ+ community was often marginalized in the media. This further silenced the voices of those who could have been helped. The aftermath and the documentary. Dennis Nilsen was eventually arrested in 1983 when human remains were discovered in his apartment's drain. However, by that point, it was too late for his victims. His crimes sent shockwaves through London, but they also highlighted the devastating effects of the cultural and institutional homophobia of the era. Memories of a Murderer. The Nilsen Tapes sheds light on this dark chapter, focusing not only on Nilsen's heinous acts, but also on how a culture of intolerance allowed these tragedies to happen. The documentary uses Nilsen's own tapes to explore his psyche, while also revealing the broader societal failures that left so many young men vulnerable. A call for change. This documentary serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of marginalizing certain communities. The LGBTQ+ community in 1980s London faced enormous challenges, and the systemic neglect they endured left them at the mercy of predators like Dennis Nilsen. While society has progressed in many ways, Memories of a Murderer forces us to confront the lasting impact of intolerance and discrimination. Memories of a Murderer. The Nilsen Tapes is not just a true crime documentary about a serial killer. It's a reflection on how prejudice and societal indifference can lead to tragic outcomes. The story of Nilsen's victims underscores the importance of inclusion, acceptance, and the need to protect society's most vulnerable.